Good morning and welcome. My name is Josebe Bilbao-Henry, and I want to thank you for joining us today in this webinar on navigating the iceberg of culture. I want to go ahead and show you those who had a chance to write some of your views in the polls that we had opened before starting the webinar. I want to show one of them to you, and then I will show the second one later. But first, let's show the results of the first poll. In my culture, we value highly. Let's see what the results are. And I see now you can see me. If we could take a moment to look at the poll results for the values that are important in our culture, I want to go briefly over some of those results. I see that many of you had emphasized work, and on the side of emphasis on work, and also emphasis on personal relationships. So I see that those are some of the elements that are going to be playing some role in our discussion today. Where do we put the energy in how we are building work relationships and how we become effective at work? Where we put the energy, whether it's on the personal relationship or on getting the task done. But before I move on, I just want to welcome you also, say good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are located. As I mentioned, my name is Josebe Bilbao-Henry, and I am the program manager for the Language and Culture program at the World Bank. We are going to be spending about 90 minutes together today, and I want to make sure that you see this is going to be a webinar, which is not going to be the usual pattern of presentation and then questions. It's going to be very interactive. We're going to have lots of polls to tap into some of your views, to think collectively about some definitions about culture, and we are going to also think about some case studies together. So again, it will be fairly interactive. Also, I want to make sure that you're all aware that this session is being recorded, which means that some of you might be concerned about your identity being revealed. Be aware that we will not show your name as we record and make this presentation available. So we are going to respect the confidentiality of our discussions today. Be aware of that. Also, I wanted to make sure that that there will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. You can also type those questions in the chat. We will be taking some questions at different intervals throughout the presentation today, and my goal is to have at least 5 minutes at the end of the presentation to take additional questions. But if any burning question comes up after today's presentation, you can also contact me at my by email, and the address will be shown at the end of today's presentation. So we're ready to move on to our presentation now, and I see that more folks are joining from different parts of the world. We are going to be talking today about how to navigate the icebergs of culture, and that is working across cultures. This is a webinar version of a workshop we do at the bank, which is a little bit longer, but I think that this is going to be an opportunity to reach out to many more people and also to tap into your own experiences. So one of the questions we had asked is, again, about your experience. And we asked to list some of the hot buttons or some of those areas of challenges that you experience at work, in your work environment, that impacts the work that you do. And the question is why we asked this. Why do we care? Well, two reasons. One is because learning makes more sense if it is connected to your reality. And second, because we find that cultural issues and cultural dimensions do play a role and do have an impact on how we do business, how we work together. Whether it is projects running on time, whether it is also being effective in the way we get our message across, cultural dimensions do play a role and have an impact on how we work together. So we had asked to list some of those hot buttons, and we're going to show you where the general view of many of you was. So let's take a few seconds just to show you where we are. And I see that there was, two of the most selected were starting and ending meetings on time. It seems that that is quite prevalent, and also understanding people's position in a negotiation, where they're coming from, where are the values, what are their main concerns in a negotiation. Sometimes those are quite opaque to us. So there are also some of you answer about getting the message across, also getting people to respond to your requests, and particularly to do so in time, and having your voice heard. These are not unusual. We see this very often, and I see that this seems to be also resonating with some of you. So in today's webinar, we will be discussing some of these challenges. And again, I want to emphasize that what we're going to be discussing today will remain in this room, will stay in this room. And as the recording of the session is prepared, we will also make sure to take out your names. With that in mind, I want to share the objectives, the learning objectives for today. And the first one is to have a model, to have an approach to analyze cultural perspectives, and those of that belong to us and those of others, to have a model to analyze and navigate cultural differences. The second objective would be to identify what are the opportunities for synergies and also the potential for conflict based on those differences and the way we communicate and we get things done. And finally, we hope to start thinking about some personal strategies we can deploy in how we work, communicate, and collaborate across different cultures, whether it's with our colleagues or with global clients. These are our objectives for today. We're going to be working in 3 different sections today. We will be working first with a definition of culture, then we will examine a model to analyze culture, and finally we will apply that model to analyze different situations and to develop different strategies. So let's start with the definition of culture. And I'm going to ask you to come up with your own definition. I'm not going to propose a definition, so we're opening a poll right now. Please take a minute to write your own personal definition in this poll. And we will not show the results yet. We will show the results later on, after we have done a little bit more reflecting and more exploring on what goes into our model of culture. I see that some of you are already writing your definitions, and again, we are not going to share the responses yet. So I'm just going to ask you to have a little bit of patience. I'm going to give you a minute or so to go ahead and write your own definition. Okay, so I see that many of you have already written your own personal definition of culture. What I want to show you, what I want to share with you is one way to analyze culture. Rather than a definition, I would like to propose a way to look at cultures, a way of analysis. We're thinking first about what are the observable behaviors or artifacts that we look at when looking at a culture, when examining a culture. We also look at the values that underlie those behaviors, and more importantly, the assumptions that we make regarding those values. Let me give you an example then. Let's take something as visible, as obvious, as accessible as direct eye contact, whether or not we look at each other in the eye when we're speaking. And I see that, that's the observable behavior. Now, in terms of the level of when we look at the values, we could think of trustworthiness and frankness as values that underlie that behavior. The assumption being that when someone maintains eye contact, it shows that one has nothing to hide. That's one way of looking at it. It's one way of analyzing a cultural behavior, such as direct eye contact, and to think of it in a certain specific context in terms of the values and the assumptions that we assume. Now, this is not set. I mean, it varies according to different cultural contexts, but the analysis still is valid. Now, this analysis comes from Edgar Schein, who's an expert on organizational culture. Something else to consider when we look at culture, and something more food for thought, is that when we're talking about cultures, we're talking about layers, and that is we have cultures, we have different cultural behaviors on account of belonging to different communities. So in this regard, we can be looking at different layers of culture. And first, I'm just going to give you the long list of what we consider different layers of culture. And then I will consider each one of them one by one. One of the layers is generational, then human, national culture, regional culture, ethnic culture. We're also looking at another layer, which is religious culture, socioeconomic level, educational culture, professional, corporate, individual, and gender, just to name a few. These are some of the layers that we look at when we look at our own personal profile, cultural profile. So if you think of it, we have culture just because, first of all, because we belong to the human community. So, the same way that bees have culture, we could look at human beings as having a culture. There are certain values that we hold near, such as the love for our own offspring and reciprocity, a certain level of reciprocity in favors. Those are basic human aspects of being human. But we also have culture because we belong to a nationality. Now, keeping in mind that national culture is a rather large construct and it is a generalization. At least it's a starting point, but it's very, very difficult to talk as a whole as of a national culture as being fairly homogeneous. Again, as just one more layer of this construct. And when we're talking about national cultures, we're also, the first thing that comes to mind is that there are also regional cultures within a nation. Who cannot identify the difference between coastal cultures or more inland cultures, mountains versus low-level or valley cultures, whether we're talking north and south, east and west. We can all recite almost chapter and verse the differences that we identify even within our own national culture. One other layer to consider is that of educational culture. in fact, it is a very strong predictor on how we tend to communicate and how we get things done. If we can, many of us can think of, those educational systems where there is an emphasis on the right or wrong answer, and as opposed to those educational cultures where there is more of a sense of exploration and engaging, and A for effort or high grades for making an effort, just to name a few. Those are two different educational cultures that have a very strong emphasis, impact on how we actually work. Professional culture, the way an engineer looks at challenges and approaches the solutions is very different from the way someone who comes from the humanities might look at a challenge. Gender. Quite often we get the question of what role does gender play in culture, and what we are, at least what I would like to submit for your consideration, is that gender is yet another layer of culture. And something else to consider that is that according to certain experts on culture, particularly to Gert Hofstede, when he looks at some of the dimensions that help analyze culture, he thinks in terms of masculine versus feminine cultures. Masculine being those cultures in which gender roles are very well differentiated in terms of functions and role and how the roles are shaped, as opposed to feminine cultures where those roles are not so differentiated. So that's something else to consider. And socioeconomic class, let's not forget that we do have cultures on account of our being members of different socioeconomic levels. It shapes our experience of the world very early in our life. It shapes our views of and our experiences. Also, we talk about personal culture, and it's not, quite often we emphasize that this is just me. Yes, it is possible to talk about your own personal culture, or your family culture, and let's not forget your religion. And religious culture as a strong predictor on how people communicate, how people get things done, how people live. So with this in mind, I would like to propose also a definition of culture and see if it resonates with you. This one is by Gerd Hofstede. I had just mentioned him. He's the author of Cultures and Organizations, a book that he put together after working for a long time with different profiles and questionnaires that he ran at IBM. And no wonder the tagline is Software of the Mind, Cultures and Organizations, the software of the mind. So his definition of culture is that the collective programming of the mind distinguishing the members of one group or category of people from another. So this is one definition that I would like to propose to you. What I would like to do now is to open a second poll and see whether you would reconsider or redefine culture based on what we have discovered so far, or whether you would stay the same. So I'm just going to give you a minute or so to type in the second poll, and then we will compare the answers and the first poll, where we had asked you for your initial definition of culture, and the second poll. So please go ahead and type your definitions. thank you for those definitions. We're going to now broadcast the results and just see what is coming from. And I see that many more people are jumping in and providing their definitions. But I think that what is interesting here is that the first definition and the second was they were pretty much on cue. I think it looks like these are some of the most common definitions of culture, and that you were right on. What is jumping right now from these definitions is that we have cultures because we belong to different communities, different human groups. And in a way, a culture is expressed, or we have cultural markers. There might be our behaviors, our ways of communicating, our ways of speaking, our ways of getting things done. And we do have those on account of being members of those different communities. So this is very interesting. Also, just something else to keep in mind. In 2014, the term culture was one of the terms that actually ran the highest number of searches in internet definitions in dictionaries. So it looks like conversations about culture and about how we adapt to the global environment are becoming much more prominent in everybody's mind. So I think we are now ready to ask an important question, given everything that we have discussed now, going back to the different layers of culture that we had discussed, whether it was gender, nation, region, religion, ethnic, and so on. I'm going to ask you also to cast your vote on what do you think are the two top layers that shape how we work and how we communicate. So I'm going to give you a few moments to answer that. Okay, so let me show you what has come through this little poll. It looks like education is one of the top layers, followed by nationality, by national culture, and then followed by profession. Now, what is interesting and I would like to highlight is that the model that we are going to present today places less emphasis on national culture and looks at culture as a combination of different factors, as a combination of the different layers that we have discussed. So rather than thinking about what are the nationality traits, I'm going to be focusing less on national cultures and more on a more comprehensive view of culture that takes into account the different layers, and that looks at key dimensions to look at when we're analyzing culture. So what I would like to do is to take a few minutes to see if there are any questions before we move on. We have completed our first part of the webinar, which was to explore a definition of culture, to explore what is our general approach and framework as we analyze culture and see if there are any questions. Please go ahead and type your questions on the chat. And if there aren't any, I will go ahead and start discussing the Richard-Lewis model, which is going to provide us with, again, with a framework and a way to analyze culture. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you the scheme that represents the cultural active, or the Richard-Lewis model of culture. Now, Richard-Lewis is an author that comes from the world of linguistics, and he was looking at patterns of communication as important predictors of how of culture. And in analyzing different patterns of communication, whether it was about providing information, reading between the lines, or looking at how people provide feedback, he identified three main styles, or three main categories. Now, we need to keep in mind that we're not talking about three categories in which you are classified. In other words, your own personal cultural style is not purely under a linear active category, or multi-active, or reactive, but rather we are a combination. Each one of us, our personal cultural style, is a combination of these three main categories. And I'm going to spend some time describing the categories. Just to give you an idea, we're going to be focusing on looking at the reactive style, which is color-coded as yellow. We're going to be looking at the multi-active style, which is color-coded as red. And we're going to be looking at the linear active style. And so the idea would be that if we are predominantly linear active, in this style, there is an emphasis on facts, on figures, on making a decision and moving forward with that decision, decision with a big D, as opposed to a decision that gets revised as it goes. An emphasis for a linear active style is about making plans and implementing those plans step by step. This is also a style where the predominant way of reasoning and of arguing is strictly based on logic and on logical arguments. So that would be the linear active style. Now, the multi-active style, there is an emphasis on in presenting arguments. These are good communicators, and they can tap into the emotional aspects of an argument. So they're very good about connecting with people. They have a very strong emphasis on building relationships before getting to perform a task. So on the task or work versus relationships, they put the energy first on building the relationships so that the task then would run much more smoothly. They are very good communicators. They're loquacious, they're talkative, and a little bit more impulsive in the sense that, planning doesn't have to take a lot. They're ready to run with the action quite quickly, and then revise the decision and the plans as they go along, because things can happen that change the plan. So that would be a purely multi-active mindset. In the case of a reactive style, and Quite often, we think about an alternative term because reactive sometimes has a little bit of a negative connotation, but in looking at a reactive style, another term that we think it's very fitting is reflective. Because this is in a cultural style that is purely reflective or reactive. There is an emphasis on observing a little bit the group and feeling very much part of a group and part of a community. It's a lot about reading between the lines. It's not something that what is being said, but also what is not being said. What is being conveyed by other means. It's all about making allowances and accommodating the group rather than the individual needs. It's about the collective harmony rather than the individual effort. So in this case, again, we think that reflective is a fairly good way to describe this style as well. So this is the third main category. So we have, again, linear active, as we had mentioned, we have the multi-active, and we have the reactive. And now we're going to do a little bit of we're going to do a little quiz, just to see whether you're getting the gist of these three different styles. Now, I know that some of you might be a little bit more attuned to this terminology because you have done the survey, the cultural active survey. Now, those of you who haven't, don't worry. I think that these descriptions are still we're hoping that it still makes sense, and then you'll have a chance to go back and use the link that we had shared with you before and still do the survey. It's a good way to get a better feel for this model, for the information, the rich information, and the newest information that it provides. So what we're going to do now is run a little bit of a quiz just to see whether everybody is attuned to the different styles and sees the meaning to it. So I'm going to ask you to write on the chat line, so be ready to write to write your answers very quickly. And you'll have to enter either linear active, and there would be LA, or multi-active, or MA for short, or reactive, R for short. And the question would be, what is each one of these descriptors referring to? So let me share the first one. Listens most of the time. What would be the style? Reactive, multi-active, or linear active? Okay, I see that many of you are typing, fiercely typing, and I see that the predominant answer is reactive. And indeed, listens most of the time is typically connected with a reactive style. Now, keep in mind that in a reactive style, in certain cultures, there is a saying that we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. Use them accordingly. So I think that this way of thinking is really very much attuned to that, to this style, to listening most of the time and reading between the lines. And it goes to some of the dimensions, some of the challenges that you had mentioned earlier. How do I make my voice heard in meetings, particularly if I am one that tends to think and observe all the information and read between the lines and observe the group before making my contribution. So often interrupts. I see that you're all writing your answer as multi-active. Indeed, that is correct. And interrupting, this dimension is often related to turn-taking. Might be a matter of how our linguistic patterns work. In certain languages, there is a lot of overlap. one person is finishing the sentence and the other person comes right in before the sentence ends. That's overlapping, and turn taking as being sometimes related to language. But in some other cultures, it is less a matter of language and it is more a matter of being engaged. It's a sign of engagement. In different cultures, this kind of behavior can actually cause a lot of friction because it's perceived as rude. Let's see, very people-oriented. Go ahead and type your answers. Okay. Very good. So here is the thing, very people-oriented as opposed to people-oriented. There is a difference in emphasis. In the case of people-oriented, if we say that someone is people-oriented, clearly is multi-active. That is very much the case. But I would like to add yet another layer for your consideration. That in a reactive style, it's less about the one-on-one, which is more the multi-active, on the multi-active side, and it is more on the reactive side because the emphasis is on the group. So very people-oriented would be community-oriented, and in that regard is more of a reactive trait. But those of you who answer multi-active, and many of you did, you were not wrong. It's just a matter of emphasis. For a multi-active, it's more of a one-on-one. For a reactive, it is more of the group or the community. The next one would be polite but direct. Go ahead and type your answers. You're totally getting it. It's linear active. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Confronts with logical arguments. And see, this one is also linear active. Okay, I'm going for the next one. That's one thing at a time. Let's see, linear active. And I would like to emphasize that this particular dimension, this descriptor of the time and task production as a step by step and doing one chunk at a time, it's is quite interesting because it's also related to a sense of timing. If time is considered kind of as a line in a linear fashion, we tend to we find it easier to perform one task at a time. If we have more of a cyclical kind of understanding or perception of time, doing one task and doing another one and retaking the next one and this kind of cyclical kind of fashion is less of a problem. The question is, where do deadlines actually, how do we play with deadlines? So that's something to consider. But I see that some of you were also writing reactive. It's also partly correct. Must not lose face, and this is an important dimensions. And I see that many of you are writing reactive, but also multi-active. And so, and I see that there is a little bit of a, thank you. Someone actually had mentioned that there is a mistake, there is a misspelling. Lose face, thank you, not lose. That's very good. Thank you so very much. So in this case, let me actually role model what I mean. Typically, I am more multi-active in the sense that I have no problem in saying, oops, there was a mistake here. We totally misspelled it. My bad. It's a mistake that I usually make, and shame on me. I didn't double check that. I can I can have a good excuse or a good explanation for it, and I move on. Now, had I been purely linear active or much more reactive, as many of you were writing, I would have been utterly mortified in even in pointing out that there is a mistake here on the slide in the spelling. It should be L-O-S-E as opposed to L-O-O-S-E. So we will go ahead and correct it. It's a very common mistake. And here I have, I have been true to my multi-active side. So I want to go ahead and continue with the next one, which is truth before diplomacy. What would be the style here? I see that you're writing linear active. Fantastic. Great. Yes. Has good excuses. I see that most of you are typing multi-active, and indeed it is multi-active. I just role played, or I just show you what I mean. I have a good explanation, or I have no problem providing some explanation about a mistake, doing it also in front of a group, and then moving on and not feeling totally embarrassed about it, and this is actually not breaking trust. So what we have done in the last few minutes was to go over some of the descriptors of key behavioral dimensions that are part of the model that we are examining. So I just wanted to make them all available here in this in the answer key. And what you have is, according to, you have the columns which go according to the 3 different distinct styles, and then along each row represents one dimension. The first one would be a little bit about turn taking, whether it talks half of the time, talks most of the time, or listens most of the time. The next row is about task production, whether it is in task production, but a little bit also about the task relationship aspect, and also with the time dimension. We also have the planning dimension, whether it's planning ahead and step by step, or planning the grand outline only and going on to implementation and correcting along the way, to all the way to the reactive style, which looks at general principles. That is less on a very concrete grand plan, but also what are the principles, which also show that sometimes plans change altogether, as because the most important guiding principle is what they're trying to accomplish. So also an important dimension is the directness or indirectness, particularly as we are talking about the providing feedback or expressing disagreement. Now, this is one of the areas where there is a greater source of conflict. Now, in very homogeneous cultures, where people pretty much have the same patterns of communication and style and cultural style, being direct is not a big problem. Now, the challenge is that even within the same nationality, you observe different subcultures. So assuming homogeneity is not always a good approach. So one of the ideas that we consider is that polite but direct is perhaps not a bad way to go. But always being mindful that there are also people who are polite but incredibly indirect, and to know, to be able to access their perspectives, to be able to access their views is also very important. So keeping in mind that politeness and indirectness or directness are important aspects to keep in mind. We've also seen dimensions such as how we build arguments, about face, about saving face, about turn taking and interruptions. Also, an important one is, as I mentioned earlier, where do we put the energy, whether on building the relationship first and then doing the task later, or whether work relationships evolve as a result of working together. So these are some of the important behavioral aspects. And one of the what we had done in the meantime is we had pulled a poll here for you, and to ask you what behaviors describe you. And rather than looking at your predominant style, perhaps I would ask you to go ahead and type each one of the not a few of these behaviors here in the answer key that describe your predominant style. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes and see. I see that many of you have already answered what is going to be our next poll, but nevertheless. So what I would like to do is, I see that some of you are writing emotional, displays feelings, and people-oriented. Please go ahead and write more of the scriptures that you feel are much more that apply to you. And I see that some of you have also written indirect suggestions as a way of your preferred way of communicating. Doing one thing at a time, polite but direct, rarely interrupts, reacts to partner's action, diplomacy over truth. Very interesting. So what I wanted to share is that in our work environment, particularly working at the World Bank, we see all these different styles at work all the time. And being mindful of the different dimensions and to know what to listen for, what to pay attention for is very important. So I see that some of you are a mix of all of them, and I think that that's also very interesting, because indeed that's one important aspect to keep in mind, is that in your own profile we are a mix of all of them. In one particular dimension we might be predominantly linear active. In another dimension we might be much more reactive or multi-active. So with that in mind, while I go through this slide, I'm going to ask you to please go ahead and place yourself along the three styles. What would be your predominant style? Those of you who have not done the survey, you can still think what you think as you become more aware of these dimensions are what is your predominant style. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide, what we have is a sample. This is the style of a colleague. And what you can see is that along listening and speaking, this person is predominantly linear active. You see the blue color. But at the same time, you see that this person has a good combination of the three styles. There is a little bit of multi-active, a little bit of reactive, and a little bit of linear active. These people tend to be what we call mediators. That is, in the triangle that we have shown earlier, they plot more towards the center. which means that perhaps they have been they have a very layered set of cultures that allows them to kind of react in a different way or to adapt in a different way according to the context. Now, let me emphasize one thing, that the model that we are discussing is that it has a certain bias towards a work environment. So many of the questions are about how you will react at work. Now, we also know that with our family and with our friends, we would have answered those questions differently if that were the context of the question. So again, we're looking about working across cultures. We're not talking about going to parties across cultures or going to or hanging out with family and friends across cultures. So that's something to keep in mind, that the context of our discussion is a work environment. And with that in mind, it's perhaps I don't know whether you recognize yourselves more or less in this in the results, those of you who have taken the survey. But I wanted to emphasize that as I see now that some of you have answered, what I would say is, like, let's go ahead and broadcast the results just to see what is the pulse of this group and what are the predominant styles. And I see that let's show the results. And I see that there is a predominance of multi-active and linear active, but also a good number is predominantly reactive. The question is that some of you are reacting I read these interesting reactions in the chat. I see that, it seems that some of you recognize yourselves in the results of the survey and that you think it is a fairly accurate survey. What is interesting, and one thing that we notice over a long period of time, we have had colleagues who have taken the survey at one point and they've taken it 5 years later. And the interesting finding here is that while there might be some variation about the predominant color along some of the dimensions, the overall picture of what is the predominant style doesn't change so much over time. So we adapt along certain dimensions, although we maintain a certain kind of cultural style throughout our professional life, I would say. So I'm going to give you some time to write in the poll some reactions to the model, or some questions about this model that might come up. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes. Type your questions or your reactions in the chat line. And I see that some of you are doing so already. And I see one question: how are we going to apply this model in practice? So that's going to be the point of the last section of the workshop. How can this framework and how can these categories help us plan ahead when we're looking at doing a project? How we communicate, how we provide feedback, how we respect, how we request feedback, how we express disagreement, how we contribute. So we will be looking at some cases just to see how the model can be applied. Some of you are mentioning whether there are some linkages between your cultural style and the country you come from. There are some. Let's remember that nationality is one of the layers of culture. Um, that and so that it does play a role, and I think that national culture is also a good construct. It is a generalization, and it is a starting point. And I should also add that culturactive and the tool that some of you have already explored um, allows you to compare your own cultural style with that of even of your nationality and that of other national cultures. And what is very interesting is that quite often what we find is that most people who have taken this tool, who have done the survey, they find that their cultural style, their personal cultural style, is somewhat different from that of their national culture style. So the question is that yes, we do have some of those elements of the general average for a national culture, but not all of them. In other words, nationality is not the only predictor of certain cultural styles. I see that some of you are wondering about the gender style. Now, gender plays a role, again, I would say, more so in certain cultures than in others. So it's yet another layer to keep in mind. But keep in mind, yes, that gender is a layer of culture. So I see that. I don't know if there are any more questions before we move on to my next question for you. But so let me ask you this, and I think that this connects with how do I apply this in practice, and I think that the missing connection here is, so we apply, we're curious about culture because we work and we function in fairly diverse environments for most people, whether it is because we are interacting with other clients from other countries or because we have a fairly diverse set of colleagues. But I see that many of you see the benefits of it. They say there is diverse perception, diverse perspectives, the opportunity to experience things differently, to see different things from different perspectives, more views, and let me see a few more. Varied approaches, more options. Exactly. So it's evident that we all get it, that we see different ways of solving problems, different ways of facing challenges, and different perspectives. So the more we tap into those different views, the better off we are in finding solutions. Now, this is not the only aspect of cultural diversity. We also have a cultural challenge for being in a very diverse environment. And what we find, going back to Hofstede, we find, and this is a little bit of what we experience from our side, in international organizations, cultural diversity is an asset. We see that, but it's also a challenge. I don't know whether I would say fatal, but it's a fairly strong challenge in the way we get things done, because well, you will tell me, why do you think there is a challenge? And why would be a challenge to have a very diverse workforce? And I'm going to open a poll for you, and perhaps you can reflect a little bit on what might be the challenges of working in a very diverse environment. I think that some of the answers here are totally, understanding where people are coming from. Miscommunication, I see it. It appears over and over again. Inefficiency, groupism. I mean, people tend to, create mini clusters along certain cultural styles. Correct. Miscommunication, inefficiency. Planning and coordination, exactly. Those are some of the sources, the greatest sources of uh, of frustration, um, and particularly if it is not managed, if it is not fully recognized, this diversity. Some voices are not heard. Some people feel excluded. There is a misperception of what contributing means and how people have different ways of contributing. And ultimately, it could run, if taken to its ugliest consequences, what we find is that a lack of trust in a work environment and ultimately inefficiencies. So, keeping this in mind, I think it would be a good idea to put it together and to start thinking. So, how are we going to use this model to apply it and to think of it, how we can approach real situations? But before I do that, I'm just going to pause for just a couple of minutes and see if there are any more questions before we move on to the third section of this of the workshop. I'll give you a few minutes, and you can go ahead and type your questions in the chat line. There is an interesting question about how do we prepare to deal with cultural diversity at work. So those are very good questions. So the question is, yes, we can prepare, and I think that awareness and having a robust model, or having a solid model on how to analyze culture and the different dimensions they play a role in how we get things done and how we communicate, and to think of it as cultural dimensions helps a great deal. So awareness, first of all, about your own personal cultural style, and then using that kind of mindset, the mindset of an anthropologist, if you will, to look at different situations. The last section of this webinar will look a little bit about how to prepare ahead of time. So the question is how, whether this kind of learning is compulsory and mandatory in international organizations. It's part of our orientation. It's part of what we do, but it's also, we recognize that people have different levels of awareness. So to make it all mandatory for everybody would not necessarily be good, but to make it available is much more important. Is to open the option for these conversations to happen. The need to tune into this kind of this intercultural adroitness is highlighted from the very beginning as part of orientation and onboarding in the organization. So now, strategies for reducing misunderstanding are, I think that, again, it's a matter of creating a deeper sense of awareness. And particularly, I think that moving beyond the idea of national cultures and getting into a more nuanced view of culture is being composed of many different layers, and that people, that you do have different cultures on account of many different factors. So creating that kind of open space, that kind of awareness is very important. So let me go on after all these very good questions and see how we can put it together and think, okay, so we do have the culture-active model, or the Richard-Lewis model, as a way of looking at certain behaviors. Now, the model and the profiles that you get also provide a detailed view about different values that play a role in how each one of us does work and communicates. But today we've been focusing on the behavioral side. So I'm staying with those behavioral side, those different dimensions that we have looked at today. Let me propose a short case scenario. A linear active person, a typically linear active person, and we're exaggerating here, someone who plans step by step, who does one thing at a time, who is very systematic on how they approach time and task. Works with a multi-active person who's fantastic on communication and on keeping in perspective the building trust with other folks. So the question is, where do you see the challenges along some of these lines? One would be along the timeline. Another one would be the planning and executing, and the task versus people orientation. So where do you see the potential for conflict here? And I'll give you a minute to type your answers. Then we're going to show your analysis. So how can you use the culture-active model to look at this situation and perhaps come up with solutions? In this case, we have two people working together, one typically linear active, one typically multi-active. And I can tell you that I see this constantly at work in my own team. From my own experience, I am very multi-active in the way I perform tasks, and it drives some linear active colleagues totally crazy. And some of you are already typing that the frustration could be high on both sides. So let's broadcast the results. See that some of you think that the target, the timeline might be a problem. Some, the multi-active person might actually be thinking that time is a little bit more flexible. The deadline is not set in stone, that you can kind of negotiate your way around it as things happen. A linear active would get frustrated thinking, no, we had already planned that, and why aren't things happening the way they should be happening? Now, some of you are focusing much more on the potential for conflict, and you see that there is potential for rejection, demotivation, the communication breaks down. But I also see that in some cases, some of you had mentioned that communication is going to be an important component. Let me see if I find it. Okay, so I see there is a response here, understanding and agreement on what focus really means to each other. So that's a very good strategy. In other words, what we tend to think that it is pretty understood that we know each other, we know how each other works. Is not sufficient, and that a certain level of explicitness and being deliberate helps a great deal in a situation such as this one. A linear active person assumes that things are going to be flowing a certain way once that the plans are laid out. A multi-active person is much more open to, how the relationship evolves and how the task evolves. Now, being very deliberate and very explicit about how you are going to move along the project and what are the priorities and the conditions that are a must to happen is going to be very, very important, so that both parties understand where there is some room for improvisation and where the must-haves have to be. So again, being deliberate and discussing ahead of time and discussing the different values and the different perspectives is going to be very important. That's one of the key strategies. And again, never take anything for granted, even if you're coming from the same national culture, because as we have seen, there are several other layers of culture that play a role in whether we are linear active or multi-active. Okay, so we're going to open another poll now to look at this other case, which is quite common. We have a linear active manager who is a lot about direct communication, and truth comes before diplomacy, is polite but direct, who's having a performance conversation with a reactive team member, someone who must never lose face. And the question is that we are going to have some challenges. And we're going to have challenges along the direct versus indirect, truth for diplomacy, or job versus people. So the question is, what do you think? What would be a potential conflict here, and how would you solve it? So the reactive is going to be, I'll be showing the answers in a moment, but I'll give you a few minutes. Okay. So I see that the truth before this diplomacy is going to play a big role here, and the reactive member is going to feel they're being picked on, and there is going to the polite but direct approach is going to totally crush the reactive team member. So on the one aspect that we see here is quite often a linear active that tends to overcorrect might not be able to get the message across and actually be as clear in the message to the reactive team member. Now, this situation happens quite often, and what we find is that building trust to the point of having the conversation, the performance conversation, is very important. So leaving everything to that performance conversation and to deal with the truth before diplomacy, and dealing with the face saving kind of strategies might not be the best approach. So that would be perhaps one important thing to keep in mind. But more importantly, this is where the preparation and doing some homework on how to send perhaps indirect messages about performance beforehand might help a great deal. One other thing to keep in mind is that any performance conversations or any kind of feedback to a reactive team member should never be done in public. But as a general strategy, we think it is very important to do a little bit of homework before and to identify whether or not indeed the reactive style is at play in this case, and how to couch the discussion in a very in a sense that does not um, crush the reactive team member and this person's confidence. But this is, again, it's an area where perhaps being slightly more indirect might help ease this conversation. And in fact, in general, as a general strategy, in most diverse organizations, a certain level of indirectness is the suggestion moving forward. However, keeping in mind that when you tend to overcorrect, then the message doesn't get across. So that's it's a difficult balance to keep in mind, but nevertheless. So let's move on to the next case scenario, the next application, and to think about a reactive person who works with a fairly multi-active team, and to think of some of the challenges that this person might have along the dimensions of listening versus talking, the never confronts or confronting emotionally, and along interruption. And please go ahead and type in. Someone is saying, I'll give you a few minutes, but I think that interesting reactions are starting to emerge. How do you think it's, this person would feel in terms of contributing during meetings with a multi-active team? You can go ahead and type something along those lines. Okay. I'm broadcasting the results now, and I see that what is emerging, that obviously this person might be left out, a little bit of a sheep in a pack of wolves, not being heard, is never heard, and those are important, perhaps important views and perspectives that I never heard. But on the flip side, the multi-active team might perceive this person as someone who is not making a contribution. So and wrongly perceived that way, and not even being able to access that view. So this is also an area that plays for it calls for being a little bit candid sometimes about one style. And in this case, the reactive person might take the lead and say, this is more of my style. And sometimes I might not have, I might not be able to mention or to butt in because you're all talking at the same time, but I'll send my comments later on by email. So in this case, having different channels for team members to contribute, which are not all happening during a meeting or in a face-to-face interaction, and having alternative views is also going to be fairly important. So that's perhaps one of the strategies that we could suggest. But again, being mindful that just because someone is not saying something, they don't have views, is something important to keep in mind. And definitely this is where the level of awareness and awareness of one style and that of others is, again, the very first step in having a strategy along these lines. As some of you were wondering earlier, is what strategies there are for reducing the misunderstanding in multicultural organizations. I think that awareness of the many different layers of culture and the dimensions that are playing a role in how people are getting things done and how people are contributing is the very first line. So in terms of keeping your personal strategy as you are approaching any kind of project or any kind of major shift in an organization, or as you're approaching a different work with a different team, I would say that there are different steps that you can take in moving forward, and this is all your own kind of personal responsibility. The first one is to think about, based on the awareness and the greater knowledge that you have about your cultural preference. I think is very important to keep in mind what is going to be what are those behaviors that you exhibit that might be hot buttons or perhaps potentially misunderstood by other colleagues. Like if you tend to be more on the reactive side, you tend to listen more, well, you might want to engage team members in a different way. As you are looking at any new situation, any new project, keeping in mind not only your style, but those of others, it's good to have kind of like a mental map of the different predominant styles that you have in your team, or working with different clients, and to create your own personal diagram according to the culture-active model, where you would plot people and think, it looks like this person might be predominantly multi-active. So these are some of the suggestions or the strategies that I could develop. But again, getting that map is going to be very important, and that is your own personal reflection as you approach any new project. Also, what would be the changes that you are willing to make if you are more reactive and you're working with clients who are much more linear active, or you're working with colleagues who are much more multi-active? What would be the adjustments that you're going to make if you are very linear active in how you provide feedback, but you're working with a very reactive culture? And finally, what are the strategies that you can do to sustain these behavioral changes? Because again, this change doesn't happen overnight. I think that it's important to discover it, to keep thinking about it, but also to keep educating yourself and learning more about dimensions. And we haven't even gotten into the myriad other dimensions that play a role in different conceptions of time, different aspects of collectivism versus individualism, and different other ways of looking at culture. The more you know, the more aware you are not only of what are the behaviors you're exhibiting, but also the different behaviors and values and assumptions that might be at the other end. Finally, the learning resources that we would like you to consider, and we're going to share this presentation as some of you were inquiring. We listed a few resources that are available online, but in addition to it, you can also revisit Culture-Active. If you haven't done your survey, you can also do the survey and do it anytime. But you can keep revisiting the Culture-Active account, and then even plotting your own personal profile with respect to some other national profiles as generalizations, just to give you a starting point to start reflecting on some of the areas of similarities and some of the areas of differences to be aware of. And with this in mind, I want to thank you for joining us today. And what I'm going to do is open the floor for some questions that you might have for me right now. But also keep in mind that if other questions come to mind, you can always reach out and send me an email. I'll be happy to help you. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes in case there are additional questions. I see one question that has been raised before, how certain cultures are treated better than others. I think that, and it might be for national reasons. Now, I think that quite often there are certain styles that have been, particularly in a corporate setting, that have been prevalent and perhaps more emphasized, and that tends to go for a linear active style. I think that more and more research is showing, and that with the process of globalization, what is happening is that we are being exposed, and we're working with clients and with colleagues from other cultures, and in that sense, making an argument for for other styles to have an effect on how things get done, or to have an impact in how a team works in order to make it much more inclusive, actually is a good argument. It's a good business case to make. So sometimes making a case for other alternative styles might be one way to go. But I also, I would say that highlighting the differences across the team, and looking for opportunities to highlight those differences might be another good way to go. The questions of the survey, you can access them by taking the survey. We don't make those available. And someone was asking whether there's going to be a second webinar to further expand on the topic. We do have a workshop in which we are looking into transforming into a webinar, which would be communicating across cultures. That is, what are some of the, what is an effective model to get your message across, if there are all those differences across the team. So, and we're looking into making this one, this additional workshop available. So stay tuned. And the Culturactive site is asking for a key code provided by the administrator. If you don't need to enter a key code, you only need to click on the link that we provided and enter your email and a password, and then you just have to remember that password and use the same email when you try to log in again. So that should not be a problem. So you should be able to actually type in, click on the link that we sent you. Okay, so with this in mind, if there are no more questions, I see that a few of you are typing, and I want to thank you very, very much for staying with us for 90 minutes. It has not been a short one, I should say, but and I'm being mindful that people are very either busy or at the end of their workday or way late. Some of you were joining from India, so I'm also very appreciative of your being able to stay with us for this webinar. With this in mind, thank you very much, and good evening, or have a good day or good afternoon.